back with Deep Images, and this is going to be our first episode in after our 100th episode. So, if you've seen the 100th episode, you know it's a brilliant, incredible, all-encompassing interview. Today, I have one of the people who was there for it, Keith Howell, and also Mr. Tim Tolbert. So, the three of us wanted to kind of do something a little off the beaten track on the way back to starting to do mini series like the Black Cinema one we've had going. Um, so we all found out that we kind of, not a big surprise to me, that we all were really big into the X-Men 97 animated show on Disney Plus. And we all grew up with X-Men, different generations, different iterations, and you know, in all modesty, really know the material pretty inside out, probably too exhaustively for a lot of people watching and exhaustingly. Bill Mulligan also was going to join us. He also grew up on this material, but he's had some health issues and some other conventions he had to attend, so he wasn't able to finish watching the season in time. So, Bill, shout out, and
Hi, Bill.
we miss you, bro. So, I'd like to just say a couple of things. Well, first of all, let me just take a moment to say that I want everyone to like and subscribe. We almost have 500 subscribers. We're getting close. That'll be a big deal. Um, and I also want to mention that we've got some new series coming up. They're incredible. We've got another interview coming up soon that's pretty wild, pretty unusual, and I think you'll really like this person. And she doesn't get much exposure. Um, but as far as this topic goes, we grew up with X-Men. Like I said, I am so old that I was buying, well, my mom was buying reprints of the original series when they were being reprinted in the regular run. So, but the thing that no one really knows about a certain age or cares about is that the X-Men were a flop when they were introduced in the 60s. They were the one thing Jack Kirby created that really didn't have any traction. I think it had less traction than Nick Fury, Agent of Shield, and
There were two
it's
actually. The Hulk also. It
the
didn't
Hulk
gain
was
traction
only a
I
flop
love
at
the Hulk.
first,
at
but when
first.
but
That's
when
what I'm saying.
Ditko rebooted it, it was
Yeah,
a hit.
but
But I'm
yeah,
talking
but
about all through its whole run.
right. Okay.
Yeah, the 60s. You're right. You're right. The Hulk did flop originally. Yes. Roy Thomas and Neil Adams, kind of and with Arnold Drake, Jim Steranko, some other people kind of quasi soft rebooted it and introduced a lot more of the hard sci-fi and ideas and reintroduced concepts like the Sentinels that Kirby had come up with. And for those who don't know, the X-Men is really part of a long literary tradition. So I've heard it called different things. I just personally call it like mutant sci-fi or mutant science fiction from the golden age of science fiction. So
Mhm.
you had these writers going back to like the 20s who were introducing these kind of elements. I know Keith can probably, bolster me here if I forget anybody, but I would call a novel like Hugo Danner, Gladiator, is kind of a
Mhm.
forerunner. And of course, that influenced Superman directly. But once you got into the 30s, I think the key text of all time for mutant fiction is Odd John by Olaf Stapledon. The Odd John DNA is in every bit of the X-Men. I mean, it's on, if I am surprised Olaf Stapledon's estate didn't like sue Marvel Comics, sue Jack Kirby's estate, sue Chris Claremont, but they didn't. But they probably could have won maybe at one time. But Marvel's a juggernaut. But there's so much literally word for word that was taken. Homo superior was coined by Olaf Stapledon to describe mutants. And then in the 40s, well, he also did another novel along those kind of lines, in a way like Gladiator, but with an animal character called Sirius, which is one of my top probably five favorite novels ever. And in the 40s, a guy named William Shira, who I don't personally know a lot about, wrote a novel about mutants called The Children of the Atom, which that was borrowed by Marvel famously, and it's referenced quite prominently in one episode of the new show. Um, and then over time, these kind of concepts kind of floated downward. Some of A.E. Van Voogt's concepts in the novel Slan. Um, so by the time you get to, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee grew up on the pulps, and Stan Lee has talked a lot about being into the spider and things, but he's never really talked much about any of this stuff I'm talking about that I'm aware of, and I've only seen about, I don't know, 10, 20,000 interviews with him, but that's probably still only a drop in the bucket. But Jack Kirby, however, has talked about the concepts, because the concepts of this group that is evolved differently, that lives outside of humanity, something Kirby has always, that's a classic Kirby thing, that he was influenced directly by classical mythology and the golden age of science fiction. And it goes through the Inhumans, it goes through the Eternals, to an extent the Asgardians, the New Gods. He's got these kind of clusters, and the X-Men were the first one he did for Marvel or DC. And the X-Men, it did kind of flop though. And I think one thing that happened is they didn't know how to do the concept, and Kirby didn't want to really stay with the book, because he's only drawing like everything else. And Roy Thomas started writing it, and Roy did some of his best early work, but it became more like a teenage soap opera. And now that's actually the strong part of it, but the weak part about it is they tried to make them more into traditional superheroes. And I think once they went in that direction, that didn't really, they already had archetypal superheroes. The X-Men were unique because of their concept. And when Marvel isn't exploiting that concept, is usually when you get the worst X-Men stories. And when they are totally invested in that, is when you get their best stories. And Roy kind of meandered for a while, and then, like I said, he left the book, and they got Arnold Drake, who had created Doom Patrol, which was a contemporary of the X-Men. Now, I knew Arnold Drake before he died. I didn't know him extremely well. One of my ex-girlfriends actually visited him in the hospital the day before he passed away in New York. I was hanging out a lot in New York City during that period. I had met him at Heroes Con, but being in New York, I saw him a lot. And, he claimed to anybody that would listen, so I heard this out of his mouth many times, that Stan Lee ripped him off for the X-Men. So the fact is, I think, let's just remove Stan Lee from the equation. And I've done my research here. I feel confident in saying that Stan Lee really had almost nothing to do with creating the X-Men. He was going to call it the Mutants originally, which, that's, at least pretty straightforward. But I would say that Jack Kirby and Arnold Drake grew up on the same kind of literature.
Yes.
And were
I would
moving
agree
in the
with you
same
on that.
direction.
They're similar creators, I think, too. You
They
can see a lot
were.
of
And if you read Arnold Drake's original Doom Patrol, which I have in this complete in this one stunning volume that's literally this wide.
Yeah, you've shown that to me.
Yes, it is some of the most clever and inventive DC writing in the 60s. It's just so fun to read.
That and Metamorpho.
Yeah, Metamorpho was a
blast.
Just batshit crazy stuff. It's
absolutely.
So
and DC
fun.
was great at that shit. And I feel like that's one. I feel like it was stunt casting by Roy to get Arnold to replace him on X-Men. And so Drake came in, and he created immediately, him and Steranko created the iconic character Polaris, or Lorna Dane, named after Lorna Doone, the literary heroine that Roy was a fan of. And
or the Girl Scout cookies, Lorna Doones.
Also. They were also named after.
Yeah, that's right. Named after the same character. Yeah.
And Lorna Dane, I think everyone who's into comics knows the classic cover with Steranko where she's levitating with this incredible costume with all the Kirby cosmic energy, because Steranko was kind of a protege of Kirby and did Kirby stuff really well. And so then they kind of went back into the Sentinels. They got Neil Adams on art. And they started introducing the idea, a lot of the tropes, and reintroducing a lot of the tropes about Homo Superior. And they introduced the trope about, tell me if I get this right. What did the first Cro-Magnon say to the last Neanderthal? And later, Chris Claremont used that a lot, but he got it from Roy, and it was really clever. And that's in the new show too. And the new show is really an extension of all this, because Claremont just poured 15 years of his life into thinking this stuff through. And again, I think when Claremont's stuff suffered is where a couple of places is where he went too much into superheroics, because he loves swashbuckling stuff, and I just think that stuff's totally incompatible with the X-Men. This is just my personal opinion.
A lot of his space stuff.
Well, Nightcrawler, but that's endemic within the personality.
I know. I'm just yes, exactly. But the X-Men overall, no. But if you're
when you start getting into that,
that's
like not swashbuckling in like the sword sense, but just in the scope. I think a lot of Claremont's like space stories with the X-Men kind of go into that territory.
But this is what's interesting: the space stories, and we'll get to this in a minute, because this is an important thing I found upon rewatching the show. Is that Claremont is kind of a more of a Hollywood sci-fi kind of thinker. Even though
Yeah, yeah,
he's a guy who's very intellectual. He wasn't even born in
yeah,
America, and during a lot of his early career at Marvel, his fiance was a Wiccan priestess. So some of his magic stuff, especially about the
yeah.
character Magic with a K, is actually authentic. I mean, he did overuse the phrase demon sorceress, but his girlfriend coined it, not him. And but it was from real life because he was writing Satana stories for a while too before the X-Men and after the X-Men. He killed her off actually, but um
Wow.
what she didn't stay dead. But I think Claremont
She's
is kind
Satana.
of, did I say Satana?
No, I'm saying she's Satana. She's not
Oh,
going to be dead forever.
no, she's not. She's not. And yeah. So basically, Claremont had a big plan, but that's not the way corporate comics really generally
Yeah.
function, which is
Yeah.
why Kirby and Lee, they were always, Kirby just wanted to just keep drawing these stories. He would have drawn them in his basement, but he did draw them prolifically because he had to feed his family.
Yeah.
Claremont, plotted the stories years ahead of time. And right when a lot of it was starting to come to fruition, it actually wasn't Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter was actually a big booster of Claremont. Jim Shooter was very destructive toward the majority of Marvel's writers and especially artists. Very cruel. I don't care what anyone says now. Revisionist thinking. Shooter's become this folk hero. Shooter was not a folk hero. He was a pretty good writer, but he was a terrible editor. He was a cruel person, and he treated some of the people that I love most in the world, like Gene Colan, like absolute dung. And that's just bad karma. I'm sorry. And
Yeah, but he kept Vinnie Coletta employed.
well, again, he had
He's
aesthetic
also
issues.
from
That's deep
my
dive.
neighborhood. He's from Pittsburgh, so that's our infamous claim to fame is Jim Shooter.
Well, the thing
Oh,
about
Yeah,
Shooter is, Shooter, the reason Shooter's been able to keep cachet is because a handful of the properties under him, not because of him, became huge moneymakers. The X-Men by Claremont and Byrne,
yeah,
Frank Miller. I don't think Claremont had any influence on anything Frank Miller did whatsoever.
I'm gonna
Piggyback.
piggyback a little bit to just say the credit that Jim Shooter probably needs to get, and as a creative, I hate it, but I do
Oh
think,
no, I'm one.
but
I'm
I
one
do
for
think
go
he
for it.
gets is I think Jim Shooter is what kept Marvel Comics from going bankrupt 15 years before they did.
I agree with that.
Because he was an obsessive about deadlines and control and getting those books out, even if they were piles of shit. As long as they got out into those marketplace, they got onto those newsstands, because this was before the newsstands, I mean before the comic shop, direct market, and into the beginnings of the direct market. And I think in that time, Marvel was easily on the brink of going down until he kind of came in and got it started running like a business. I think in the 70s, the string of editors in chief that were going through back, lasting 6 months or less, and then the next one, and then the next one, it just puts everything off kilter in the business side. And he fixed that.
If we pull back though, and I think the material they're adapting for the movie successfully, it's coming out of the 70s, vindicates this.
Yeah.
The material during the revolving door of editors is much more classic than almost anything since they've done.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the stuff that Roy Thomas commandeered was much stronger creatively than stuff.
To kind of piggyback on what you both were saying a little.
Piggyback away.
I think one of the reasons that the X-Men are so strong, and one of the reasons why I think that this particular iteration of the show, is kind of so beloved right now, is because I feel like, unlike a character, say like Spider-Man, say Thor, say the Hulk, who have all had amazing creatives, they have the X-Men have been reinvented pretty much every decade that they've there's never been like a singular thing of the X-Men. It's always been new rosters, new things. It's like a palimpsest.
Sometimes that hasn't always been a good idea, though.
No, it hasn't been, but they're definitely reinvented more often.
Yeah, and because X-Men is a concept.
Right,
It's not,
exactly.
Superman is a character, Spider-Man is a character.
Yeah, yeah,
X-Men is a even Justice League. It's a team, but the X-Men is
yeah,
different. It's a
Mhm.
concept. It involves a
yeah,
team, but it's
yeah,
a concept. And I
Right.
think that's
yeah,
what you're talking about because
yeah.
yeah, each new creative grouping comes along, they take that concept and they
Mhm.
sort of mold it a little bit. And
And, yeah, and
and
that's
I'll
one
tell
of the
you what,
reasons
I
that
think the concept is just simple and brilliant, but yet
yeah,
when it like what Henry was alluding to about it failing initially, is
yeah,
I don't think it was well thought out at the time. I think it was a throwaway concept by Kirby just to fill a demand by Lee in the moment to get another book out, get another
Mhm.
team book out.
Yeah.
And he used, yes, that familiarization that he had with the reading as he was when he was a kid of the sci-fi stuff, and he just like quickly just churned out pretty much some pretty basic and in a lot of ways lame characters. A guy with wings like an angel, a guy who's big and burly and jumps around, a guy who looks like a
hey, don't
snowman,
make fun of me like that on camera.
a guy who looks like a snowman, a girl who is just, everybody wants to,
Yeah.
be in love with.
Even her
And
generic name, Marvel Girl,
Marvel girl. Yeah, I mean, there
stuff
is
very
no
ridiculous.
thought given to this.
But the thing
And
is, for
and it's
Kirby,
because
that was just his leftovers. But compared to what Kirk
exactly.
says,
Yeah,
it's iconic.
Exactly. But
yeah,
those things could have just come and gone. And
Yes. Yes.
but somehow there was something in the concept
Mm.
hmm
that lived beyond the lame
yeah.
characters and
That's
allowed
also
creatives to come in later and make those into
yeah.
characters because they were such
That's also
ciphers
one of the
to start with.
yeah. That's also one of the reasons I feel like so if you took like every X-Men comic ever made and you just stack you put them all in a collage and then you took like Spider-Man. Spider-Man has like a uniform quality to it.
Hmm.
Every X-Men comic, no matter how good or bad the artist was, they're vastly different. The
Hmm.
quilt of the X-Men is
Yeah, because it's a
so
very adaptable concept.
correct. Yeah. So that's why you kind of will look at something and you'll like, a kid now might pick up an X-Men comic from the 90s and be like, who are these people, that are on the X-Men? I mean, it was always new rosters, it was always new artists, it was always all these new things.
But that was
And
only
one of
after
the things I like,
Claremont. But there was
sure,
stability.
yeah.
What I was getting at with Claremont is he was on it for
Mhm.
15 years, so there
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
overarching vibe to it, and I think
Yeah.
he really took it to the next level, and
hmm
stole even more stuff from Olaf Stapleton than Jack Kirby had. And it's fine. Like Alamal Farouk is Adlan from Odd John. That's like one of the most obvious. First time you read Odd John, you're like, oh, this is X-Men number 117. Okay. Um, Not knocking that though. There are worse
Yeah.
influences.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but I gotta say that when they what I was making my point about Shooter backed the X-Men success to a point. Now, when they fell out over the Phoenix story, Byrne, who was the little bootlicking corporate guy, Daddy's favorite, and
Hmm.
him and Shooter stayed in good, Whereas a Shooter, who had Jim Salicrup as an editor, and again, Jim Salicrup, someone I've met who's told me this story face to face,
Yeah,
is
super nice. Super
they
nice
were
guy.
the pariahs, and
Yeah.
so Claremont always resented Shooter after that, and the only reason Shooter really put up with him is because he sold a lot of comic books.
Exactly. As long as you sold comics.
And then
Yeah.
Shooter finally got his comeuppance and was ousted. And Bob Harris, who seemed cooler, actually turned out to be also, even more frantic about not being able to. Well, what Keith said, he wasn't as good at keeping the company afloat. And
Yeah.
so he wanted Claremont to, instead of opening
Mhm.
up the storytelling like he finally wanted to do, he's probably thinking Shooter's gone now, I can really tell it all. But they're like, nope, you can't kill Charles Xavier permanently. We don't do that at Marvel.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that corporate mentality is what controls Marvel today. I'm
Yeah.
not saying
Well,
it didn't control Marvel during the 2000s, early 2000s,
yeah. Yeah.
but
Well, they also tried and failed to kind of get rid of that concept when they did the Ultimate stuff, because their idea with the Ultimates, I think, like, well, we're going to make it edgy, and when they die, they actually die,
Well,
this type of thing,
actually,
and that
no,
didn't
the
really work
actual
with.
you're right on one
Yeah.
level, but actually
Oh
when
yeah, yeah.
Jameis and
Usually I'm right on at least one level, so
yeah,
that's
one
good.
level. Jameis and Casada actually did make a manifesto when they took over the
Oh,
company,
okay,
and they
okay,
one of the many things was that the characters will stay dead from now on. I stopped collecting Marvel in '93. I had no interest in reading characters that were
yeah,
not the characters I grew up with. I
yeah,
would follow it because I'm obsessive about knowing things. So
Yeah,
I
I'm
did I
like
did
that
grab
too.
the X-Men at Eckerd's, and I'd be like, actually, post Claremont, X-Men on the steam of Claremont was one of the very best written comics Marvel had in the '90s, and
yeah,
Well,
I would,
that's that for people like you and me, that has been the benefit of the internet. Because yeah, I as hardcore an X-Men person that I was from about, I'm gonna say 77 through the 80s, I pretty much stopped
right.
about 89, I think, maybe 90.
I
Hey, you
There,
look
started the
pretty
same.
good
when
for
I
was it?
you
stopped
When
at
look
the
was,
pretty
same
good for
time.
I mean,
Keith,
when
you look
was,
pretty good for being 89, I think. I really want to know
The
what you
shit. Hold on.
but that when was it that they did the relaunch of X-Men 1 with Jim Lee? Was that
That was
90?
'91.
91.
Mhm.
Okay. It was
I
probably
didn't
then
stay that
in
far. I didn't
yeah,
stay.
it was probably
I
after,
almost
it
did.
was after that. I was starting to
Okay.
drop off, and I remember picking that up to go with
Mhm.
it, trying to jump back in,
Yeah,
trying to
his art was
look at,
pretty nice at
and
first.
I was trying to jump back in, but it didn't hold me more than a few issues and I was gone. And so I really have, I mean, other than just sporadically picking up an X-Men story here or there, all of my tracking along with X-Men after that is has been just like whatever I'm kind of
Well,
catching vibes on, or it's the cartoon or the movies, you
it's
know.
funny you say that, because there was a period of time, like, I used to read all the time when I was a kid. Then I stopped reading. Then when I was a young adult, college, going into my 20s, I was reading more and more. So there was a period I just was not reading comics, and I would go on the internet and I would follow what was going on. And with the X-Men, it was so funny because it seemed like one day, like, Wolverine did this, and then I pick up the comic again, and it's like there's like alternate dimensions and Krakoa and all these things. And I'm like, when
Right?
did
That's
all
the
this
Yeah.
very
stuff
modern
Right.
stuff.
happen?
Yeah.
And I
Hard to
got, I'm like,
follow
when
if
did
you're
all
not reading
this?
it.
Yeah, yeah,
It
exactly,
is.
exactly. So
I have
yeah,
researched the stuff though. I stopped collecting Marvel permanently in 2005, with the exception occasionally I'd pick up like Ed Brubaker's Daredevil or something of quality, but I haven't. I mean, I personally hate, I'd say 90% of the material that I've seen since 2006.
I would say I'm probably at 98% of stuff. It just
Yeah, I
doesn't
mean,
resonate with me.
once Civil War was considered a great comic book, I was like, I'm out. I mean,
Civil
the
War
movie
was a real
vastly improved on the comic
Yeah,
book.
Civil War was a bit of a deal breaker for me. I wrote a scathing review for Ain't It Cool at the time.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I
Oh
was the
yeah.
only person I knew that, and what was embarrassing and weird for me was I was trying to get a job at Marvel at that period, and things started changing really fast because what's interesting, and this is how I rate these regimes, is we were talking about Shooter. When Shooter took over, all the great artists and writers of the '70s quit Marvel and went to DC, and that's what created the new DC with the new Teen
Yeah.
Titans and Swamp Thing. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
now it happened again in 2005, Jemus's era, and it's fashionable for a lot of people to knock him, but he was a visionary, and his books did sell, and they were very adult, much more adult than anything before or since then at Marvel. They were much more like what DC had already been doing since the mid
yeah,
80s. They were much like,
yeah.
maybe we should catch up with DC now and start doing some really high quality material.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so they got high quality writers and artists and brilliant new people. And that's when they had Grant Morrison on X-Men. That's when I started collecting X-Men again. That was before the movie came out. No, it was after the movie. I didn't start collecting again because of the movie, but I did start being interested in X-Men again because I loved the first movie. And Morrison did too, because he said it's done the heavy lifting for us. It's peeled back to the core of like core characters, core concept, and
Yeah.
it's science
Core of the
fiction,
concept.
and it's not over bloated, hard to follow. And what Morrison did was dig very deeply, and there's an enormous amount of Morrison's DNA in this show too, even though his books came out after the time of the animated show. Now, ironically enough, even though the producers of the X-Men movies wanted to get away from the ostentatiousness of the animated series, structurally and story-wise, Bryan Singer has claimed that the animated series was what influenced him the most. He was not a comic book reader of the X-Men, but he loved the animated series. He grew up on the animated series. Well, he's about my age, so I don't know if growing up might be a stretch, but yeah, he was young. Let's put it that way. Yeah. And that's fine because I think the key to adaptations is being able to distill the concepts. And I think all of these men did a great job in the 2000s. I think Morrison did a great job on the comics. I think Singer did a great job on the movies at first, and I think they brought a lot of the other British invasion writers over to take over X-Men, like Peter Milligan wrote X-Men for a while. Mike Carey did the last X-Men run that I loved called Supernovas, where Rogue was the leader of a team of mostly reformed villains. I mean, that was some sweet stuff, man. And we'll get back to Rogue in a sec. She's a big component of this new show, which I wasn't expecting. But it's really not.
That's what we talked about earlier.
I'm almost to where I'm almost through the outline to where we're going to actually talk about the show.
That's okay, because the foundation needs to be there because the cartoon it has the weight of so much that's gone before.
My generation. See, here's the thing: my generation. I was born the year that X-Men the animated series first aired. So by the time that I was watching it, I was catching
Tim Tolbert 92.
Yes, Tim Tolbert 92. And then I was catching the tail end of the show, and then I would watch it in syndication, and they would do it later on down there. So as a result of that, I just remember when they would do the different cartoons, they do Spider-Man the animated series and Fantastic Four and all these things. When they would bring Marvel characters into those shows, to say Captain America showed up in Spider-Man, the X-Men showed up in Spider-Man, Ghost Rider was in Fantastic Four. That was kind of our version of the MCU at that particular time.
Yeah,
because we were getting all those characters. The movies weren't fulfilling that. We were getting all of those characters in there at once, and I actually like that even with us being a little bit spoiled by that, because now in the movies they could just do that, the way with their hand. It was still kind of cool to see some of those other characters show up in.
You were unlike me and Keith. Thankfully for you, you weren't old enough to realize that all that was a result of extremely tangled legal bullshit.
It
didn't have anything to do with creating or writing stories.
But you're right. Sure, because I was obviously older. I was in my 20s at that point during all of that. But I was also, I was tuning in because that felt more like the comics at that point in my life than comics did. But you're getting X-Men and you were getting Fantastic Four and you were getting Spider-Man, and they were all in a pretty consistent art style and approach
they even did a whole big crossover episode of Spider-Man the animated series that had the X-Men from the animated series.
A lot of crossovers.
I thoroughly enjoyed the Spider-Man series as an adult, even though we had silly kid related things like Morbius.
I have mixed feelings on the
sucking plasma through his fingers. Instead of blood with his mouth, so because they weren't allowed to have him actually bite anybody. A little silly stuff like that, but I get past that. If there was
part of the charm of that show for me is stupid shit like that.
See, to me, the Spider-Man show is charming, but I don't think it's strong storytelling the way the X-Men animated series was.
No,
and maybe because you have to have a structure. And if you're going to adapt stuff that's very convoluted and melodramatic and complicated and soap opera-ish with all these concepts, you need to have a deft hand. And I think they realized that, of course, they suffered a lot of interference before the show even started. I read yesterday that the show was canceled twice before
Cameron
came on. And that Marvel hated the show at first. Marvel and
I was thinking about Spider-Man. That was
I'm talking about X-Men.
X-Men. And the X-Men cartoon was doing trying to do so much. I think
very ambitious.
at the time it was maybe beyond its reach to do at that time, but we can do now. Is they were really just trying to grab every storyline and put it in there. I mean, they were mining the comics like you have never seen before, and they had so many years worth of stories to be
They
pulling
pretty
you
much
know?
adapted most of Claremont's 15 years,
Pretty much, which is
albeit not
why
in linear order. But yeah,
which is why I was a
Well, that
little curious what they were going to do with X-Men 97 in terms of
well, it's funny you
picking up
say
with
that.
storylines, you know.
It's funny you say that because he and I literally just talked about that today, which, and this might be me getting way too ahead of ourselves, but I said that one of the things that I was curious about is the original version of the animated series covered all of the major classic storylines: Dark Phoenix, Apocalypse, you had Future Past, all that. 97 starts to do it a little bit differently because Bastion wasn't in the original show, so they did it a little bit differently. But now it's like, where do you go from here?
well, now they're
Because
adapting
a lot
two
of the major
primary
stories-
texts.
Yeah.
Well, now
They're taking the Scott Lobdell, Fabian Nicieza 90 stuff, which was not being adapted that much because it was running at the time of the show, and they're mixing in pieces of the Grant Morrison 2000s, and he's adding his spin on it.
And they're also still pulling in
Yeah,
from
still
classic
pulling
Claremont.
pieces. Yeah, like Madeline.
That whole the way they did the Madeline Pryor storyline, I thought was a brilliant way to incorporate it
Oh, it was
into
great.
a continuity that didn't actually allow for it. And it's like,
Sure.
there you go. And so, I mean, to me, they're clearly setting up Age of Apocalypse for the next round, but they're also, I think, heading towards where X-Men are or were until just recently with in the comic books. I think they're heading towards that with X-Men 97 over the next
eventually
3-4 years.
Well,
I think that's where they're trying to get to.
The thing I made the argument for is that I think that what they'll do is they'll even take things that say has happened in the comics in the past 10 years, like we'll use Krakoa as an example. They'll take that and they'll repurpose it into the 90s in the sense that they'll make that part of their history, even though it didn't exist in the comics.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They're already taking the stuff from the
they're doing
it. The stuff that Jemas and Quesada edited by Morrison and Milligan and Joe Casey and Chuck Austin, who gets a bad stick, but I loved his run. One of his characters was on the Genosha Massacre, the Sammy the Fish Boy.
The Fish Boy. I used to go to school with the Sammy the Fish Boy, believe it or not.
I wonder where he is. There was really I was happy to see him. That was really a good story because it was his kindness was one of the things that made Juggernaut reform, and it made it believable that because Juggernaut was beaten as a child for being a mutant, and so they really got deep into that kind of stuff. And there was a great issue that Chuck Austin wrote where Juggernaut's like, yeah, I guess I'll join the X-Men even though I'm not a mutant, and first, he has to get off legally, and so before he gets off legally, he has to get off. So he does both. He's lawyer She-Hulk, and they have sex so hard that their whole apartment this is true. This really happened. Their whole house is destroyed, and now that's supposedly been retconned out because it's too.
I hate when that happens.
But I don't pay attention to that shit.
I hate when that happens.
But then he says to Xavier says to him, Kane, he didn't just beat you. I mean, he beat me. He hated me more. I wasn't his son, And so that gives you another layer to Xavier, which I personally had never read before. But once they, I know I talk about that era a lot, and I was an adult, but that era, it came after the show, but it was an indelible era because the comics are still mining it. They're still using Grant Morrison's characters constantly, not well. But they're using them, and it's like if they hate him so much, why do you keep using their characters? Oh well, so why not?
I also propose that one of the big major storylines, like from the '90s and the 2000s, they still haven't done that they'll probably do is the Onslaught stuff as well.
Yeah, I think they were setting up Onslaught. Yeah, with what they did with Magneto at the end. I think the Onslaught is on the way. Yeah.
Because they did Fatal. Well, we'll get into all this. They did Fatal Attractions, which was before Onslaught.
Yeah.
So everybody watching, if you don't know the X-Men, this is going to be probably hard to follow because like the original animated series, like the current animated series, like the movies, this stuff isn't really linear, and neither are memories, obviously. So we're jumping all around So if you can't keep up, at least watch
Yeah.
the video long enough to give us a view and put a like on it. Um,
Yeah.
if you can keep up, you're in good
Yeah.
company. So, you're my people. But the animated series, yeah. So that was basically my whole context. I think we've got it pretty up to the date. So what I've been struck by was this project seemed to me kind of like a silly idea at first, me personally, and I
Yeah.
liked the show.
Yeah.
But Marvel is so unpredictable. Before we started filming, we were talking about Kevin Feige and the way he treated the,
Right.
to me, brilliant Netflix Marvel shows, and I wasn't happy with the way they were treated, or any of the Marvel TV. Like, I'm a big Hellstrom fan, and Disney kind of act like those were the bastard stepchildren. But I kind of feel like, so you don't know with Marvel now, like their next project could be incredible, or it could be
Yeah.
just about unwatchable these days. It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
It is impossible
Yeah.
to predict for me.
Yeah,
And
it's
they're
like
In
the,
some
like
ways,
the
there's a little
comics
bit of
became.
excitement with that.
right,
Yeah,
the
in some
comics
ways,
became.
for me, there's kind of an excitement. It's like, will this one suck or will this one be good?
Yeah,
I
there
don't
is.
know.
Yeah, that's all we've got left is the
Yeah.
excitement. And right now, I am very positive about Deadpool and Wolverine.
Oh yeah.
I just, I think it'll be fun. I don't know that it will be the
If
greatest
I'm
thing.
laughing, I'm liking. That's
I'm
all that
enjoying the
matters.
material that they're very slowly, judiciously parsing out to us.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I feel like the show was going to be like, oh, it's going to pander to the 90s fans. It's going to pander to Tim's generation, really, the millennials. And they're going to be
Mhm.
like, oh, look at this great. Well, I'm just saying that's who was kids when the show came. I mean, Keith and I were
Yeah.
adults watching it, but I mean, there were kids
Right.
who were the target audience, ostensibly.
Yeah.
People
Well,
like us
yeah.
could enjoy it because we were comic book nerds. So,
Yeah.
let me speak to just right off the bat then. If we're going to jump on into the cartoon.
Yeah.
The part of my um description, I guess, of what the experience was that first episode that I started
Yeah.
watching, X-Men 97.
Definitely.
Why I just like went, whoa. I feel like out now having watched the whole series now is that they did something that I would think is impossible. They didn't copy what the style and approach of what came before, but they instead somehow created something that feels like your memory of the cartoon. So if you grew up watching that show, or if like me, you were in your 20s and 30s, early 30s watching that show when it originally aired, you have your experience in your memory. This
Oh yeah.
captured that rather
Yeah.
than slaves. Because when I went back and I watched a little bit of the older episodes again, I was like, wait a minute, it's not really as much
Mhm.
as close to it as I thought it was.
Mhm.
It works with the same, or basically the same designs, but makes them
Mhm.
better.
Yeah.
A real noticeable one is Nightcrawler. If you watch
Yeah.
the original designs on the show versus Nightcrawler now, you see he's very much more like the comic book than the
Yeah.
cartoon
Yeah.
version prior to
Yeah.
it. But it's like that throughout all of them. But
Mhm.
really,
Mhm.
the key was the opening theme sequence.
Sure. Yeah. The theme's
Re-recorded
awesome.
the re-recorded music that made it better, that orchestrated it stronger, and it hits cinematically instead of like a
Yeah.
television. And it was like, wow, that's how I remember it.
Right.
And when you go back and watch the old show, you go, wait, that's not near as dynamic as X-Men 97. And even the opening animation, they're copying
Mhm.
what happened in the same way, but
Yeah.
better. It hits harder, it hits
And they're
better,
also
it's cleaner.
sneaking in new
And they're
shots.
sneaking in every episode. And that's what I was going to say. If somebody hasn't actually really paid attention to it, every episode has a different opening sequence because there's always something in there that is changed that is either reflective of the episode
Mhm.
before or
Mhm.
a preview of something that's about to
Well,
happen.
they do that. They do that with the roster too. One
Yeah,
episode has
that's what I'm
Bishop in
saying.
the roster. Then when
But
something happens to Gambit, I don't know if you want me to say what happens to Gambit.
We're getting
The
yeah,
roster
I know
changes
they
and that
do.
kind of thing.
They absolutely
Yeah.
do.
Mhm.
And it's just so well thought out that way.
Yeah.
And one other thing before we start talking episodes, there was obviously an intention to evolve the core group to become less the animated series and more reflective of the comic books. So now it's sort of like it's sort of a retro approach, even though it's a more modern approach at the same time.
Yeah.
The original animated series kind of wanted to sort of make the characters reflect that 90s sensibility, and somehow X-Men 97 is taking these characters, the costuming particularly by the end, back to the 80s.
80s.
Right?
Yeah.
And so and I didn't know how much I wanted to see Cyclops with his full head mask. How much I wanted to see Storm in her classic Dave Cockrum designed outfit.
Can you move so the audience can see your graphic a
yeah.
little bit? It's not too big.
Uh,
It is. It is Aurora, the mistress of the wind.
But you know, or even getting to see now Wolverine in his brown and
that was
tan outfit that came after Days of Future Past. You know, it's like there's a nostalgia feel.
I wrote down all the costumes for that episode. So
yeah, I'm telling you, it was. But the progression to get there, and you know, they earned it. They get there, and you're like, by the end, you're like, wow, what an experience. It's just
I don't know what it entirely is, but like for me, a lot of animated shows that people recommend that I watch. You know, I'm a Star Wars fan. You can bleep that out on the actual final edit later, Henry. A lot of those animated shows takes me a little bit to get into because there's something about animation that I have a distance from. And there's some kind of, you know, the pacing might be off. There's a lot, just things that don't connect with me a lot with animation. But somehow X-Men 97 really just from the
bleep
beginning
that out too, but go ahead.
Yeah. From the beginning to the end, just it was like a cinematic experience. I didn't look at it as
cinematic.
It's a highly cinematic. The direction.
I didn't look at it being this is animation. In some ways, it was like a very sophisticated motion comic, and I mean that as a compliment.
I can't speak for you, Tim, and I can't speak for Keith, but and I definitely am not in the league of Kalen by any stretch. But I have seen quite a lot of anime, and this show looks like an anime. It doesn't look like an American show. It looks like a Japanese.
It does have a bit of an anime. Yeah,
and I mean that in the best of ways possible.
There's aspects of when I think anime that I don't like that this doesn't do. And you know,
I agree with that.
You know, action lines, that kind of stuff.
No, but anime isn't a genre; it's a medium.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But that's when I think of anime in a negative sense, that's what I'm thinking of. And this has none of that
predominantly.
Right, but this
anime is like manga. Manga, people think manga's the genre. It's not. It's just Japanese comic books. Yeah. They actually have more genres than any American comics have ever used. And I mean, you see Japanese people, salarymen on the subway reading a sports soap opera comic book. You know?
Yeah, I saw a manga the other day of Les Miserables. It was like the whole novel adapted into like 4 different just giant paperback mangas, and I'm like, wow, there really is a manga for everything.
Well, the most remarkable thing
Hamlet was a manga, which just blew my mind.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. The most remarkable. Go ahead, Keith.
We have the benefit of X-Men 97 in that we have the modern technology, and you have the money, and you have the streaming option, high resolution stuff. So I mean, the previous show was done for limited animation.
Yeah.
And now we don't have that. That's what I think is the cinematic feel about.
Now Disney has a ton of money behind it. Whereas
that's what I'm saying.
The old show, they were broke.
It's kind of funny and worrisome to me because it's like X-Men 97 is so awesome that then I'm worried that when they actually do the MCU live action X-Men, it cannot possibly live up to how cool X-Men 97 actually was, you know. So it's like
you're gonna do the disconnect of,
moments. Well, as much as you love some of those moments, I'm like, you know, I think when they try to do that in a movie, it's not going to nearly be as awesome.
I feel like their approach is going to have to be different because you can't have these are half-hour shows mostly that have to move through the action parts a little faster. And you just don't ever get that in a movie. I mean, even Endgame didn't have that kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah, it was 3 hours.
So I feel like, yeah, in a live action film, you have it's such a different experience. So I'm expecting that it definitely won't be like this, but I think they're gonna be trying to figure out ways. Whoops, where'd Tim go?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, I can't see him.
Yeah,
Anyway,
he went this mode.
there he
last
goes. Okay.
Are you?
I did that, by the way, I did that on purpose.
Oh, okay.
So,
sorry.
Okay.
I thought I lost you.
Aesthetic decision. No, go ahead.
no.
Anyway, I thought I had
I
just
was,
put you
I
on.
was trapped. Wait. I was trapped in the Phantom Zone. Help me.
But anyway, I think you're right. I don't think they're going to, but I don't even think they're going to try. That's what I feel like. I think they're going to try to evoke.
They should try.
I think they're going to try to evoke the relationships, the visual look to it, but in terms of pacing and approach, and story approach, I think they're going to try I think they're going to try to cull things down a lot. I think one of the key things about X-Men 97 is I think they did a lot. Every episode really crammed in a lot of story and plot. And I think the movies are less likely to try to cram that much plot into 2 hours, but I could be wrong. But
I also like their ostentatious costumes. I've always liked their ostentatious costumes. So
I like
part of me kind of wants that in the movies. But
I don't care. I don't care because you know why? Because that's not part of the concept. The concept was well, hold on. They had uniforms, and when the book got canceled, and Roy Thomas tried to bring them back, they were like the Fantastic Four originally. They didn't have costumes for about a year or two when they guest starred, fight Morbius and stuff, because they didn't need them. They have very distinctive visuals, and that's why adapting the first movie was so easy to do without the costumes.
Yeah.
To me, the costumes are, if done well, a nice bonus. Or if there's, to me, but again, see, this is kind of how I feel about it is, I feel like that stuff went so far in that direction in the 90s and was indicative of that era Marvel that I didn't care for, that I think I just disconnected completely. Like I don't care about that. Now, if you guys do, that's cool. And I don't have any problem with what Keith said about the 80s costumes appearing. That's a great feeling. But the live action movies have kind of never been able to really make up their mind about how they wanted to do the X-Men. And I think the MCU stuff has always retained, no matter what the changes visually, they've tended to retain the most iconic Jack Kirby designs. Thor's hammer, Captain America's shield, Wakanda, but they didn't retain Magneto. They changed him a lot, but they gradually changed him back because that helmet is so iconic.
It's iconic, and I think that is really the key to, I think, Feige's approach on all this stuff is look for what is the most iconic, which means for the X-Men, the most iconic for the most part is going to be that Claremont era in the 70s and 80s primarily. However, just note that at the end of the Marvels, when we got that sequence that showed Beast and Binary, they were very comic accurate and cartoon accurate for
and
film.
Movie accurate too.
Yeah, for
grammar, and they had
exactly. So you had Kelsey Grammer there, but they took aspects of the cartoon series Beast. They gave him the little teeth under there. They flared him a little bit more. They put him in the lab jacket. These things that are very iconic to the animated series, and pulling in Binary, but having her being an alternate version where it's not Carol Danvers, it's the other chick.
But during the Claremont era, it was Carol Danvers.
But during the comics, it was Carol Danvers. But but in the continuity of the live action movies, it makes sense, since Carol they've kind of established through some dialogue and stuff that she is a multiversal aberration. The others it's always supposed to have been Monica, not Carol.
Right.
And Carol in this universe is the aberration.
Right,
Okay.
because yeah, Monica's mother
So
was Captain Marvel in 838.
right. And
Yeah,
so here we yeah, and so that's what I think that's what they're
I
playing
There's
with,
totally,
also
yes,
which is going to
absolutely.
make Carol unique,
also
but it pulls from the comics is all I'm saying is like
Yeah,
in
it's
yeah.
seeing
yeah.
and you're going to see that costuming is going to attempt to emulate,
Well,
I
there's
think,
also the thing in Multiverse of Madness. You have Xavier's chair is
is
that kind
the
of
animated
supposed.
Yeah.
series.
They also use the animated series theme when he comes out at the end of the night.
It's right there, yeah.
So I mean, they definitely have a
So,
reverence for
see, I think
the
synthesis is the best way to
Yeah.
do
Mhm.
any adaptation at this point of complex material. And you know, 20 some years ago, I read an interview with David Bowie, who was going through a visual art phase, and it was quite impressive stuff. And he was like, the future of art is hybridization, otherwise it's extinction. And I really think that's true of this stuff. I think, you know, the DNA of these things has to encompass their whole scope of all their usable and memorable material.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think everything Keith just mentioned, that's exactly how I thought when I saw Marvels. Is you're thinking on these multiple levels because you're taking these different texts and different media and you're synthesizing them together. When it's done well, like it was in that scene, it's pretty incredible. You know, and
Yeah.
it affects different people different ways on different levels. And I think this show is the best example I've seen. I haven't felt this much resonance since I saw the first two X-Men live action movies,
Mm.
and because there's a lot of resonance in those, despite all the changes.
Mm.
You know, when you first see Wolverine, I started to tear up. Well, not when you first see him, but when he walks out in his flannel and lights a
Yeah,
cigar,
likes that.
I
Yeah.
was like, it's fucking Wolverine.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'd never seen anything like that in live action of a Marvel character.
Yeah.
I'd
No, I
never,
agree.
you know, not to knock, you know, Lou Ferrigno or anything, but he just wasn't the Hulk the way I knew the Hulk.
Knock away at Lou Ferrigno.
Yeah, I know, I love Lou Ferrigno, but I'm just saying that was Wolverine. You know, he wasn't short, but other than that, he was Wolverine. And Hugh Jackman has, and I'm seeing in this Deadpool material, uh, they're playing this Wolverine who is a variant to be
Yes.
even more like the comic book Wolverine
Yeah.
and even more cynical and jaded, which is how he's depicted in this cartoon.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know,
Which I wanted to segue a little bit because what you just
all right.
mentioned with him in the cartoon, one of the things that I think it was just really amazing is, you have the actors in the movies. The actors in the movies, to some way, became kind of a template. I mean, most people, when they think of Wolverine, they think of Hugh Jackman. So
Right.
you go back to the animated show and you go to the voices in here and how the voice acting, how does it do justice to those characters? It's kind of, for example, the voice actor for Wolverine, I think his name is Cal
Right.
Dodd.
Yeah.
One of the things that he does that I find really, really fascinating is that, yeah, he has like a cartoony voice for Wolverine, but it's also a realistic voice simultaneously. Like it's
Hmm.
one that, because, like, for example, as much as everybody loves Kevin Conroy as Batman,
Hmm.
Kevin Conroy's Batman voice wouldn't really work in a live action movie. It would sound kind of
Right.
like silly. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that a lot of the X-Men voice actors, they kind of find a way to do like a comic booky voice, but then they also, it could sound like they were real, real actual flesh and blood person.
That's because this show has a good director, Chase Conley,
Yeah.
and good
Yeah,
co-directors.
yeah.
Because those directors are making those actors from the '90s not be so over the top when they don't need to be.
Right.
For
Right.
instance, who's the name of the actress who voices Storm?
I don't remember off the
Oh,
top of my
yeah, but she's some Broadway actress and she's
And is
so
she
good.
black?
Yeah. Yeah,
Really?
she's
Now,
so
see,
good.
I'm used to watching it where in every episode she's just over the top. So when you got to this love affair with Forge and her friendship with Jean, I was like, this woman actually can really actually act.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
Like I
it
can't
was
remember her name, but she's this Broadway actress.
it was the best
Very,
Storm
very good.
that I had seen adapted outside of the comics. I actually prefer it to the comic because I was never a big fan. I like the concept and iconography of Storm. I never cared for her personality. That might be on personal intentional because she's so kind of arrogant and flighty. But I always, she does that demands respect. And
There are two voices in this X-Men 97 that I am just all about, and she is the number one. I
okay,
mean, I just think she just nailed
yeah, she's incredible.
every line. But the guy who Ross Marquand, who does Professor X, I think just did a fantastic job also stepping in, because he's not he's doing kind of a sort of an impression of the guy before him, but he's just so much, he's just emotive in a realistic way, you
Well, it's
know.
interesting you say that because one of the things that I talked with Henry about earlier before we did the show, when we were talking about some of the voice acting, was that, and I felt this even with the original animated series, and maybe I'm just spoiled with Patrick Stewart, but I never
That can
really
have an
bought
impact.
I never really bought Professor X's voice in the show. It, for some reason, like I think that it does good for what it is, but it never really was executed to me in a believable way. There's something about the timbre of how they make Charles Xavier on the show talk that I just was never, and that's no disrespect to Ross Marquand, to the guy who did it
I
beforehand.
think the
But there's
original guy was a little stiff, and I think Marquand has taken the timbre of his voice and made it a little more expressive. But again, that's good directing.
Yeah.
And as far as what he's saying, that's good writing, you know.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing to where, you know, this isn't as much of a, you know, a traditional like Marvel, like farm out a bunch of stuff, you know, as we can afford it, like the original show and like old comics used to be. I mean, this is really where you're actually trying to get talented people.
Right. Yeah.
They are putting their stamp on it, just like in the live action movies.